our study of the book of Proverbs. As we continue this week in week number 7, we're shifting gears a little bit. In the first 6 lessons, we primarily looked at Solomon's instruction to his sons and to his children, and he addressed it as my son multiple times. In this next section, a group of lessons, we're going to be looking at Solomon's essentially wise sayings. And these are a bunch of collections of statements and sayings. Some of them are short, some of them are a little bit longer, like the one we're going to look at today. They're very repetitive. You will read something in Proverbs chapter 10 that you'll read almost the same identical statement in Proverbs chapter 14, and maybe a very similar one in Proverbs chapter 18. And from chapter 10 all the way through chapter 29 of the book of Proverbs, so the majority of the book is composed of these short sayings. And so it's a little bit hard sometimes. For me, it has been hard at least to pick out, why is this same verse or same saying in chapter 10 and chapter 14 and chapter 16 or whatever. And so thankfully we have some Hebrew scholars. We have some people who have read a lot of Hebrew, a lot of people who have read some of the wisdom literature that Solomon would have written and written along the same lines as. And so they're able to take and through their study break these down into groups that make it a little bit easier for the rest of us to grasp. And we're going to look at one particular group today, and it's Proverbs chapter 14, and we're going to look at verses 8 through 15. And this specific group of verses is referred to as a chiasmus. And a chiasmus is essentially a poem or a statement that means the same thing forward and backwards. In other words, whatever you say at the beginning is what you say at the end, and they both have a same or very similar meaning. And today, we're going to look at verses 8 through 15, so you have 8 verses. And the way it works is verse 8 and verse 15 essentially mean the same thing. Verse 9 and verse 14 mean the same thing or convey the same message, and backwards. So the truth of this passage, this entire passage, will actually be the pivot point of it, will be the last group of verses that we look at in verses 11 and 12. And it's kind of the gate, the hinge, if you will, on which this whole proverb swings. So if you imagine a central point, and that's verses 11 and 12. And we're going to read all of the verses in just a minute as we get this kicked off. And then on each side, that's supported by statements that are building up to that culmination there in the middle. It's a poetic usage. It's a style. It's a way of writing that helps with memorization, helps with teaching a particular point in a catchy way. And and I'll just give you a really quick one. I started looking around. Okay, what is a chiasmus that we would use today, or something that you might be familiar with? And one of the ones I found was this one. It says, "Never let a fool kiss you, and never let a kiss fool you." Okay, so never let a fool kiss you, and never let a kiss fool you. And so similar meaning, reversage of the words and the wordings and the style to essentially communicate the same truth. Be careful in your romantic relationships. And so that's what this same thing happens in these 8 verses. So we're going to read verses 8 through 15, and then we'll get in and kind of break them down in 4 different sections as we go. So, fools mock at making the sensible person's wisdom, verse 8 of Proverbs chapter 14. The sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. Fools mock at making reparation, but there is goodwill among the upright. The heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. Even in laughter, a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. The disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. The inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. So we're going to kick it off right there, verse 15 and verse 8. They are the similar passages, and if you will, they are the ending point for this proverb. The central point, the beginning point, is verses 11 and 12, which we will look at in a few minutes. So the sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. That's verse 8. Verse 15 is this: the inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. And we look at this word, and the word sensible in the King James Version and in the ESV and the NIV is interpreted prudent, okay? And I like the word prudent a little bit more than the word sensible, because for me, I understand that one better. Now, sensible may work for you, but I understand prudent better because I understand prudent to mean careful. And so the idea of sensible is somebody who correctly evaluates their actions, okay? So when you think of the word way, we think of a long road. But what Solomon is using here is literally a path. The word way would have been a path. And to visualize it as a path would have been something that was used consistently. If you can imagine, if you grew up maybe on a farm, and if you ever had cows in a pasture, you would have found out that cows use a particular path to get from one spot to the other. And a group of cows in a pasture will literally wear a rut through portions of the pasture as they walk from a feeding place to a resting place or a shaded place or whatever it is, because they will use a very similar pattern of path that will eventually run a rut into the ground. And that's what Solomon is describing here. So what he's saying is this: the man who thinks, the woman who thinks and gives wisdom to consider their way, to consider their behaviors. So it's not just one shot distance, like just head in one direction as far as you can, but their way as in their regular pattern and their regular choices. But then he goes on and contrasts that with a fool by saying this: but the stupidity of the fool deceives them. And the idea of stupidity there is really the word stubbornness. And it's this idea of someone who essentially says, I'm going to do it my way. And if you've ever had a toddler or been around a small child and they've insisted on putting on their own shoes or putting on their own clothes, this is the same type of behavior that Solomon's describing here. So the sensible person, the careful, the prudent person, they plan their behaviors. They give thought to them, and they allow wisdom. And wisdom, remember, is understanding and correct knowledge of who God is and who we are in His and our relationship with Him. So the careful person gives thought to God's thoughts about their behavior, but the foolish person says, "Nah, I'm doing it my way. I'm going to do it my way." And really that is found and revealed in a lack of discipline. In a lack of discipline, in a lack of not caring, in a lack of consideration to the impact of their actions and their behavior. And it's the idea there is of somebody who is constantly saying the wrong things or even potentially doing the wrong things at the wrong time. Just this person that has so applauded themselves at being able to make their own choices that they don't give any consideration to anyone else. And so we have the first verse is contrasting the careful person with the foolish person. And then he repeats that a little bit differently. So let's look at how he says it in verse 15. The inexperienced one believes anything. Now, he just said the stupidity of fools deceives them. In other words, they choose that. Now he is saying it this way: the inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. Now, once again, what does he mean by that? Because it seems like he's really just throwing these thoughts out there. But thankfully, and through the study of our passage, we have a way of digging a little deeper and below the surface there. And when he says the inexperienced one believes anything, it's not that they're just simply gullible. Now, there are some gullible people in this world. I know a few. And it is sometimes fun to fool them with a statement or a trick that they cannot seem to grasp or understand at the moment. But this is simply describing somebody who believes in the moment what suits their choice for the moment. In other words, whatever they're doing at that moment, whatever decision they've made to do, they're not going to listen to anybody tell them any differently. Okay? And let me give you an example. When I was a kid growing up, we would sometimes go down the Rainbow River, which is down in Denellen, and it's one of the spring-fed rivers in Florida. Beautiful, at times very wide, sometimes a little bit more narrow, but clear water. You can see the bottom. Cold water because it's spring-fed. And as you would go down these rivers, and we've also been down the Chutney River. Many times I've taken a lot of our students down that river. As you would go down these rivers, there would be ropes hanging from the tree, and there would be places to jump off, and there would be places to do these things. And this is giving you the idea of a young man or a young lady who watches everyone else go off the branch and swing out into the river and drop down. And they decide that that's not good enough for them. And so they proceed to climb higher up into the tree to a higher branch. And even though everyone around them is advising them not to do it, they say, I'm going to do it anyways, because they've made up their mind that that is what they must do. It's also a way sometimes of how we excuse things. For example, maybe we're a fan of a team or something, and the team or the players do something that's blatantly wrong and against the rules, and we kind of do this. Yeah, I didn't see it. I don't understand. It doesn't matter. Everybody else would have done it. And that's the picture there of when he says the inexperienced one believes anything. The idea there is of someone who chooses to only listen to the things that support their previous beliefs. And this is a dangerous place, and that's why he calls them a fool. But the sensible one watches his step. And when you think of the word watch there, you have to think about this here. The analogy is of somebody who is measuring what they are doing. So picture a rock climber, okay? Maybe you watched on TV this week as Ford revealed their new Bronco, okay? And you watched the commercial, and it showed, I think the young lady was rock climbing at one point in time. And I've never gone rock climbing, and I have no interest in rock climbing. Kudos to the ones who do it. But you don't just climb up a rock face. You look and you evaluate where you are putting your hand, and you test the grip. And then you evaluate where you're putting your feet, and you test the footing. And that's the picture that Solomon is giving here of someone who says, okay, I think I know the right way, but I'm going to evaluate it. I'm going to take that and I'm going to put that up next to God's wisdom. And we're going to look at in just a minute what God's wisdom ultimately is in verses 11 through 12. So this idea is of the one who only listens to that which supports them, and the one who carefully measures everything they hear. Then he moves into verse 9 where he says this, fools mock at making reparation, but there is goodwill among the unright. And then verse 14 says, the disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. You see, the idea there is the fool is the one who refuses to recognize the role that they have played in anything that has gone wrong. You see, the idea there of reparation is to pay back for something, to fix something, to try to take care of a problem, to, if an animal has gotten out and it's harmed another person's crops. In the agrarian society in which we used to live, it was understood that the owner of the animal would be responsible for helping pay reparations for the damage it had done. The animal did it, but it was his animal, and it was his responsibility to keep it secured. So all of Solomon's readers would have understood this. That the idea is the fool is the one who says that my actions and my attitudes really don't matter. I can do what I want. And once again, it's this idea of selfishness that's promoting this foolish behavior. And then he says this, but there is goodwill among the upright. And let me go back for just a minute about the fool. One of the dangers of this behavior, this fool behavior, is, and oftentimes it'll reveal itself in this statement, things like, I'm a self-made person. In other words, I brought myself here, and I will make sure that I continue to care for myself. And by the way, no one is a self-made person. You didn't create yourself. You didn't feed yourself when you were a child. You didn't do a lot of other things. You didn't teach yourself potentially how to read or do fractions or any of those sorts of things. So while you may have worked very hard for where you're at, none of us are self-made people. And he contrasts that with the upright. The righteous or the upright are those individuals who do goodwill, or there is goodwill among the upright. In other words, they are always on the lookout for how their behavior impacts other people. And this is really a strong call to us as followers of Christ who want to live in wisdom, to evaluate the things we say, potentially even the things we wear, especially for, we think of it in regards to students and, the statements that are on your clothing, the statements that you and I make, maybe through media or through friends or in crowds or whatever. And this idea of goodwill, of trying to do good for everyone. We have to watch our words. We have to watch the things that we say. Going back to media, we have to watch the things that we post. And there's a danger in thinking, I agree with that person there. I'm just going to share everything they say. And man, we lose goodwill in that because we stop concerning ourselves with how it impacts others. And the righteous or the upright realizes, and let me read straight from the commentary here. It says, harming others violates their own covenant with God. Isn't that an amazing thought? That causing harm to others actually violates and contradicts our own relationship with God. And then he says, the disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. This is verse 14 that's contrasting verse 9. And the idea there is, listen, you do what is right, not because you get to finish the scale and not because you get to decide on the reward, but because God ultimately will decide on the reward. So Solomon's challenge to his readers here is to believe and live and act as if God is really in control, and as if we are eternal beings built for resurrection, built for God putting us on a new heaven and a new earth with a new body to live out his fulfillment for our lives in the new heavens and the new earth. So as he says this, we're realizing that his challenge here is to love God and love your neighbor, which is what Jesus said the entirety of the law rested on, those two principles, love of God and love of your neighbor. He says the disloyal one gets what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. And I love that idea of using that word disloyal there, because when we violate our covenant with God by violating others, but when we violate others, we are violating our own covenant with God. And what a strong reminder to us. Verses 10 and 13 say this: the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. I think it's so interesting that right after he says, trust in the eternal God, trust in God's eternal plan, that he says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. Then in verse 13, which is the flip side of that one, he says, even in laughter a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. And there is a strong reminder there that we cannot fully ever know what someone else is experiencing. That we can't necessarily judge it based on their behaviors and based on their attitudes and based on their presentation. That our evaluation of other people is very small in regards to what is actually happening in their lives. It says the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. Happiness, is a product of a person's circumstances, but joy is a choice that we make, and so it's a private thing. It is a internal thing that comes from our heart, a heart that is resting in God's promise and God's love. And so as we look at that, it's right there, right before he hits his crux there, his absolute middle solid point that he's building this on. He just says you can't know and fully understand what someone else is experiencing. So let's hit verses 11 and 12. I've said it's the central theme of this entire poem, and it's the central part. And if you look at it from that way, and if you build this poem outward on it, 11, 10, 9, 8, and 12, 13, 14, 15, you will see that this is the central part. And this is what he says in verses 11 and 12. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. Verse 11, that says that. Verse 12 says this: there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. These, and going back here, these are the central verses of this chiastic, or this chiasmus. It's a chiastic unit. And so they are communicating his central theme. And the central theme here is what you do matters. The choices and the behaviors that you fill your life with, they actually matter. they actually mean something. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will perish. And there's a contrast right there in those two phrases, the wicked house. And you're thinking of a permanent structure. It looks good. The idea there is if you look at the wicked, man, their lives look solid. They're successful. The selfish people are successful. The selfish people have the things that they desire. And you look over here at the righteous, and they're living in a tent. And they're living in a tent because they've denied themselves. They've denied themselves. They've served other people. They've cared for their neighbor. They've worried about the realities of everything that's happened around them. And so the idea is the wicked, the evil, the selfish one, they look secure. The righteous one looks insecure. But one is going to perish and the other one's going to flourish. And so the idea there, the one that flourishes, is of a garden that just blooms. That it's been cared for and it's been tended to and it's been watered. And all of a sudden it just blooms. And so Solomon is saying this, that what seems, and he's just told us that appearances can be deceiving, okay? And he says this, the house, it looks secure. The house of the selfish person will be destroyed. It's going to rot. It's going to corrode. But the tent, that which looks temporary, is going to bloom and flourish. And then he reminds us by quoting back another verse that has a very similar pattern to it, and the same reminder by saying there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. In other words, there is this idea that what looks right can actually lead to death. And remember, he's just said the house of the wicked. The house looks right. Most of us would prefer a house over a tent. In 95-degree weather, I definitely prefer a house over a tent. In rain, I prefer a house over a tent. In, almost every circumstance of life that is a possibility, we would prefer a house over a tent. And the idea here is that looks right. He says there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. And what is the end? And we think of death. Death is ultimately, it is a separation of man from God based on man's rebellion. Based on an unwillingness to follow what God has called us to, based on an unwillingness to submit ourselves to Him. And this is an ongoing call. This is an ongoing relationship that calls us to establish who we are, that calls us to commit to who God is and to serve Him. I don't know if you knew what the word chiasmus meant. It's Chiasmus. Chiasmus. This is the poem that Solomon wrote for us to help us understand that our trust is to be in God and that our life is to be of service to Him. And we must correctly evaluate the things that we're doing to know whether or not we are serving Him. God bless you. Thank you for joining us.